committee and housekeeping comments. First, we have discovered a lot of the folks in Habersham have not signed up or have not registered for the new Habersham site, where you receive all the invitations to all the social events. You don't want to miss the barbecue soon. You don't want to miss the holiday party. Please sign up, and we've got these cards in the back. Debbie, if you can stand up, she's got cards, so after the event, see Debbie if you have not signed up, because you will not receive an invitation. We realize that I'm the first out of the gate with the Habersham History Talks, and only about half of Habersham has registered for this new site. Okay? Secondly, as far as housekeeping is concerned, please turn off your cell phone. And the event will be recorded, and you will receive a link to the event in the next couple of weeks, so look out for that. Also, please hold all questions till the end. Captain John Martin is going to have a little bit of a Q&A, and you'll have time to ask any questions. And our event will promptly end at 8:30. Now, I'm thrilled to introduce our dynamic and engaging speaker this evening, Captain John Martin. Captain John is the lead captain for Beaufort Dolphin Adventures, which offers unforgettable experiences on the water. I hope when you came in that you picked up one of these fabulous pamphlets. But I just want to brag a little bit about this group. Rob Alexander, who's going to say a few words, is the owner of Beaufort Dolphin Adventures, and they just received the best boat tours of the Low Country in 2024. So a big hand to Rob, and come on up to Rob.
Jump to the end of this trip. We're going to do this at the end, but we're going to do this at the beginning. Hey, so Beaufort Dolphin Adventures, we started this about 2.5 years ago. It is a private boat tours that we offer here in Beaufort. We operate out of the Port Royal Landing Marina. There's the picture here is downtown, but there's another marina there over by the Ladies Island Bridge that y'all might be familiar with. We operate out of there. We do currently do boat tours for up to 6 people. And last October, we ordered another boat that'll take us up to 12, depending on what the Coast Guard gives us. It'll definitely take us up to 12. But it's almost October again. We're still waiting on that boat. So 2025, we should have that thing rolling. It is in Charleston, being worked on right now. Going through all the approval process with the Coast Guard. So we're looking forward to offering bigger tours. We get a lot of people want to take their grandkids, their kids, their grandkids, and numbers get over 6 very quickly. So we're looking forward to being able to offer 12-person, maybe even more trips next year. Our tours typically highlight nature, history. John is my primary captain. I also run a fishing charter. And so we started this, and John took over basically as the primary captain for this operation. But occasionally, you'll get me out there as well. Dolphins, history, it's kind of the things we cover when we're out there. So, yeah, Port Royal Landing Marina, and then year-round booking. Everybody wonders, do we operate in the winter? We do, as most of y'all know, and why a lot of y'all are here is because we have these mild winters. Sure, you don't want to be out there every day, but the winters are actually a great time to go experience the Low Country. So you can book us online, you can give us a call. But yeah, we'd love to get y'all out there. Anyways, with no further ado, I'm glad y'all get to listen to John. I always describe John as, I learn stuff when I get out there on the water with John. I always enjoy that. And then I call him oftentimes Beaufort Encyclopedia. So y'all will enjoy that this evening. Not to put any pressure on me.
All right, great. So let me give a little bit, thank you, Rob, and congratulations again. Just a couple other things about John I want you to know. Which I thought was very interesting. Not only is the lead captain for the Beaufort Dolphin Adventures, he's 3rd generation Beaufortonian. Is that the way you pronounce it? Is that right? Beaufortonian. He spent most of his life on the water. His passion for the water started as a kid, running John boats through the marsh and then crewing on shrimp boats. He holds his 100-ton master captain license and has captained a variety of boats, including tugboats on the Savannah River, sport fishing boats, tow boats, tour boats, every kind of boat you can name. He has been on. Tonight, Captain John will speak about the Port Royal Sound, then and now, The Port Royal Sound is a vast place, rich in history and natural wonder. Captain John will share why this particular sound is so unique and how it's changed over the years to be what we have today. So please welcome Captain John Martin.
All right, so I'm usually a conversationalist when I talk about all these kinds of things, so doing this as a instructional or something like this is a little bit different, but I'm do my best, so please bear with me. Let's see. The Port Royal Sound. It is unique in so many different ways. It's actually kind of unbelievable. It is one of the only places on the entire East Coast that is solely salt water that enters into the land. Now, no other inlet sound can actually claim that, where they are usually connected to freshwater rivers that are leading out of the mountains and the river systems and swamps and stuff that work their way out towards the ocean. Like one of our biggest ones that we can compare to is right down the street from us, or right down on the other end of the county, the Savannah River. It's 465 miles long, starts in Lake Hartwell, brings fresh water all the way down to the ocean. Nowhere in the Port Royal Sound is there a river of significance that brings fresh water to the ocean. There's enough salt water that comes and goes from the ocean twice every 24 hours. Takes about 6 hours and 13 minutes and a few seconds for it to go out. 6 hours and 13 minutes and a few seconds for it to come back in. With that being stated, we'll kind of start to dive into what really created the Port Royal Sound. And we're going to take a step way back in history. So 50 million years ago, you can see our coastline here. Beaufort County, actually all the way up to the Piedmont states, the Piedmont part of the state, Lexington, Columbia. If you've ever driven up I-26, you've seen Dixiana, big billboard signs. That is where the beachfront actually was 50 million years ago. Now, as time has progressed and the polar ice caps actually started to freeze, the polar ice caps came all the way down to where this top blue line is. Which is eventually what dug out the Great Lakes. And then also on this chart, it's kind of hard to see, but over here where it would have come down, then you would have created the Grand Canyon and things as those stuff would have started to melt. Now when all of this up in the north was frozen, our water line was all the way out here. Now this prediction is not to scale, but they do predict that our coastline was about 50 to 60 miles out into the ocean at this point in time. Now this is only 20,000 years ago. So a lot of our life and things at that era is gone. It's covered by water now as the ice caps have started to melt again and the water line is starting to build its way back up to give us the coastline that we can see here today. Now, the Port Royal Sound, I'll go back so the charts look better. So, the Port Royal Sound. Ocean out in this area here, as the water comes in from the ocean, it leads, the main channel is Broad River, which is right out here. I'll show you guys back window here. It leads all the way up. That red line at the top, that is the Broad River Bridge, which is just down this way. As that water filters in, and it's somewhere 950 million gallons of salt water comes in with the tide, and it leaves with the tide, which is kind of crazy. That is actually what has dug out all of this channel. So none of this is from glacier, none of this is from rivers that have eroded it or anything like that. This is all as the ocean creeps in and the ocean creeps back out. It has dug all of these little channels and waterways out here. Now, the Port Royal Sound is called an embayment, and you will hear it called many different things. An embayment is basically a long version of saying a bay. We have shortened it with our slang and terminology. You will also hear it called, historically, the Spanish would have called it brain sound, sorry. The Winu River, which would have been a Native American, the Wanine River, the Portus Regalis, the Port Royal River, Port Royal Entrance, and the Port Royal Sound System, which is probably one of the most modern terms that we use. If you've ever had a chance to visit the Port Royal Sound Foundation, they use the term sound system a lot. Let's see here. So in the Port Royal Sound, with not having any fresh water working its way down to slow that incoming tide, we average an 8.5 foot tidal swing. We are the largest tidal swing in the southeast. Now, like last week, we had that big full moon, that real pretty full moon that we got to see without all these clouds that we have out here tonight. We were up almost 10.5 foot tides that we saw for a few days there in a row. And we can see in certain times of the year and certain spring tides, we will actually see 11 foot tides as well. Now, with this being very ancient, as we kind of looked, we saw 20,000 years ago and things like that. On this, it's kind of hard to see, but we do have some barrier islands that are a part of the Port Royal Sound. Hilton Head is technically a barrier island. Bay Point, Pritchard's, and those areas out that way. Hunting Island eventually, and things like that. Now, barrier islands are not that old. Not as old as everything else that is behind them. Barrier islands are only about 4,500 to 5,000 years old. They are basically sand deposits. As that current and wind kind of moves down our coastline, it settles on certain areas and builds beaches, also destroys some beaches. Hunting Island is constantly shrinking. The next island down the road, Fripp Island, is growing exponentially. Those beach houses, I remember as a kid, the surf would splash underneath the houses. And then now, today, there's about 300 yards of sand out in front of those houses, which is pretty impressive. Which leads us into our area. So in our creeks and our rivers, which we use the term creek and river in our area very loosely. By true definition, we do not have creeks or rivers. Those go back to that freshwater movement. So a true definition of a creek or a river is a downward flowing movement of fresh water. With our tides coming in and from the ocean, we don't have those. Now, in the era when they came around and they were labeling and naming our areas and our waterways and things, creek and river was not truthfully defined at that point. Webster had not written his dictionary yet. So we use those terms, but as that water moves in and out, it does dig out the banks around our islands, creating our mud flats and our rivers out here, and then we start to get into our spartina grass and things like that. And then as you get into higher elevations that can support a little bit more life, you'll start to see different types of grasses and things growing as well. And these are home to basically all of our small animal life that starts in our marshes. Shrimp, crabs, little bait fish, and things like that. Now, all of our animals that we have out here, some very key ones, and we do see some really cool, we see the dolphins, which are awesome. We can get a little bit more into those on tours if you'd like. A lot of different types of birds, but the big key one up there up top are the oysters. Oysters have been a substance for humans in this part of the world for a very, very long time, and that is what brought humans to this area. Originally were the oysters. It was a massive food source that could support a ton of people. Not to mention they could subsidize as well with hunting and other animals that we would have in our area as well. And that kind of leads us into our Native Americans. So we can think back to that map that showed where that water line was way out off the coast, that 50, 60 mile area. That's when humans actually started to migrate to this part of the world. Now, there's always been a Native American history in our area. There's always been this magic number of 12,000 years. Everybody's like, well, where does that number come from? We're like, well, that's when we started to see these different types of fossils and our arrowheads and things like that. They followed what would be referred to as the Clovis people. And they were what we know of that came across the Bering Sea on the land bridge, and then they worked their way across the United States, and they made their way all the way down here to South Carolina, basically, and Georgia and Florida. Now, that 12,000 years is something that we are starting to very quickly realize is a very shallow number for our date for people living in this part of the world. They are actually starting to think that it's more like 20,000 years. So when that water line was way offshore, most of a lot of that Native American history that we didn't know existed actually does exist. It's just way off of our coast. Now, with the oysters bringing people here for food source and things like that, there were some Native American religious properties as well. So around our area, this is actually an aerial photo of an island just outside in the Broad River. And these round circles that we see in here are shell rings. And then you can see, this one is actually up around Edisto, but it's probably the best picture of one that you can see. This is Fig Island. But these are just outside your back door on Dawes Island. But these mounds basically signify where the people were coming, they were feeding on these oysters, and they knew that these oysters had some sort of spirit for them, because they fed them, and they made tools out of them and things like that. So they used them religiously, and they would make these ceremonial rings, as we think. We're not really 100% sure, but in these rings, we do find a lot of artifacts as well. And by research with the Native Americans out west that are still living on reservations, we do see traits that when they make a clay pot, that pot has a spirit. And after that pot or that vessel is no longer usable anymore, they actually hold a ceremony where they chip that pot into smaller little pieces and they release that spirit out into the world. These shell rings are riddled with pottery. And that is not a new thing of them releasing that spirit. That is something that they have always done. So the fact that we find all these shards of pottery and things in these shell rings signifies that they were a very, very spiritual part. There are some other shell rings around our area in the Port Royal Sounds, some very significant ones. There's one on Hilton Head. It's called Green Shell Ring. Pretty easy to get to. You can drive to it. It's right there next to Hudson's Seafood. And you can get out and you can walk. And these things are 50, 60 yards across and things like that. There is a theory that they were used as kind of like a farmer's market almost at certain times of the year. They knew everybody, all the different tribes knew where these rings were, and they knew when they were supposed to be there. They would meet there. No wars, no disbeliefs got in between. That was there for trade. That they would come to these areas for those purposes, as well as religious purposes as well. Now, Native American history in our area is the information is very, very sparse. We do know that when first Europeans got here, there were about 19 different tribes here. This is early 1500s. Very quickly was that information just kind of lost. All that documents of the 19 tribes in Beaver County was all third-hand recorded. There were people that were here that visited, that ended up going back to England and then would eventually talk to a scribe that would have written down what they had encountered. So we don't have an actual true account of our Native Americans in our area. Now, with the Europeans coming, so Spain got here first. And Spain basically claimed all of this land. It was a great place for the trade winds as they were coming out of the Caribbean. They would basically get pushed straight into our sound. They could stop here, they could resupply, they could get some water, hunt, get some food, and then they could set back out and they could go straight back across over to Europe. So it was a great kind of corner that they could, resupply and things here. Then the French arrived here. Very shortly, 1520s, the French came here, and it was actually one group. It was a group of French Huguenots, and they actually, believe it or not, they came in the Calabogie Sound, which if you've ever had a chance to boat around the Calabogie Sound, coming in from the ocean there is pretty treacherous, but they somehow sailed in the Calabogie Sound, which is technically part of the Port Royal Sound system as well. They actually made it to Bluffton in the May River, May 1st. That's where the name comes from. Then, not really knowing where they were, they actually portaged small boats across Bluffton and then across Spring Island and Kalawasi until they found the Broad River, and then they came on across to Paris Island, and once they got to Paris Island, they said, this is home. So they actually built Charles Fort on the very tip of Paris Island. Now, this group was led by a gentleman named Jean Ribault. If you travel around Beaufort, you've probably been on Ribault Road. Notice who it's named after. Now, once Ribault got out there and was looking off the end of Paris Island, looking out towards the sound that came in from the ocean, he said, this is Port Royal. He is actually the one that named Port Royal. Once he got his patrons kind of set up and established here, he actually left to sail back to Europe to get the rest of their things, to bring it back to them. He ended up landing in England and was arrested for religious persecution. That era, their religious beliefs were not sought after by the king. So he never returned. He never came back. Then the patrons, through a bunch of mishaps, fires and loss of supplies and things like that, and mutiny and all kinds of stuff, eventually decided they were going home, that this was not the place for them. Crazy story that they built a boat, open boat, out of the timber off of Paris Island, and they sailed back across the Atlantic Ocean without a compass, without charts, without a sextant, with no knowledge. Most of them were not actually sailors. They were just on a hope and a prayer that they made it. They eventually did land just off the coast of England. They actually wrecked into England, where they were picked up by an English warship, and then most of them were arrested, where a handful did eventually make their way back to France, back home. After the Spanish down in St. Augustine got word that someone else was moving into their territory, they came up here, and on that exact same location, they built their fort, San Felipe. Now, none of this was actually ever really charted. A lot of the waterways and things were kind of drawn out on some very crude maps and things like that of our area, but the home site was never actually recorded. So after the Spanish fort was kind of covered up and was lost and things like that, we basically lost to know where that was. Every historian had a theory. All these great islands and these great places to land these big ships along shore and our sounds and things like that, but they never knew exactly where it was. And it wasn't until in the 70s, they were actually starting to work on the golf course over on Paris Island. They were starting to build it, and they actually started to unearth structures. And actually, believe it or not, my grandfather was one of the original people that actually started the excavation on what they didn't know at the time, they eventually figured out was where Charles Fort actually was. There was a monolith, which is actually in a museum, we think now. And then this monolith here was actually constructed to replace the one that they found that was buried underneath the Spanish fort that was here. Which is a crazy, crazy story. Then we kind of fast forward. So the Spanish used this as kind of, like I said, like a seaport and things like that. Then the English came here. And once the English made landfall here, they wanted this land, and they wanted everybody else off of their land. And the Spanish had kind of spent more time down in the Caribbean and Central and South America, so they basically, with a little bit of a fight, they actually gave up with this area. That's what drove, at that point in time, the Native Americans were driven out of here as well. The English did not want them on their land. They actually did create a reservation. It was one of actually the first reservations in the New World that was actually out by Dalton. It's the island just across the street from Dalton called Palawana. It was the Palawana Reservation. It was for what the English referred to as the Casado, which is basically another term for Creek Indians. The Casado didn't last very long, only a handful of years before disease and starvation got to them, and then they kind of ceased to exist. And then the English brought in another tribe called the Natchez. They were not from around here, not exactly sure where they were brought from, but they were actually brought here to be the protectors of the Port Royal Sound. They were used as scouts and, to watch for the Spanish and things that were trying to return. Then we kind of fast forward a little bit more, and we get into another very big part of the Port Royal Sounds, and that is the Battle of Port Royal. That's what we're looking at here. Now, during the Civil War, Beaufort County was very sought after. The Union knew that if they could control Beaufort County and Port Royal especially, they could shut off any kind of troop movements, supply movements moving between Savannah and Charleston, which were the two bigger powerhouses in the southeast down here. So they mounted this huge invasion. They brought all these ships down. One of the new commanders of the Southern Fleet was Captain DuPont, which if you've ever painted anything, you've used something of his family's, which that family still owns a lot of land here in Beaufort County, believe it or not, over on the Columbia River. But they brought all these ships down, and instead of congregating right outside the Port Royal Sound, because there was two forts. There was one on Bay Point, the Confederate forts. There was two forts, Bay Point, and then over here on Hilton Head. Instead of congregating out here in the face of the Sound that these guys could see that something was going on, they went on down off of Savannah. And all the ships got there eventually. Some were lost in storms and some got completely lost. One ship actually ended up in Fernandina, Florida, somehow or other. Then the day of the battle, they started to bring all the battle up here. Now, the invasion in the Battle of Port Royal is the second largest maritime invasion to Normandy. So bringing all these ships up here, and as you can see, these out here, this is Joiner Banks. It's not the easiest thing. Today we have channel markers and things, and it's pretty easy to run in and out of Port Royal. But to navigate this without all of that, it was pretty treacherous. They lost a handful of ships just trying to get to the mouth of Port Royal before they could come in. And the battle plan was basically, they sailed sailing ships down here, and they had introduced steam-powered warships. Now, those warships were actually towed by the sailing ships down the coast. And then once they got off the coast here, or off the Port Royal, they cranked up these steam-powered ships, and they actually started to tow the sailing vessels so they could utilize every single cannon that was brought down here. that they had. And they basically came into the Sound in between Bay Point and Hilton Head and just started to do circles. And they were bombing both of these forts until they basically started to see white flags, because the forts just did not have the artillery to fight against a fleet of that size. Then during the rest of the Civil War, Beaufort County was occupied by the Union. On the island of Hilton Head, for the rest of the Civil War, there were more Union soldiers than there are full-time residents there today. There was over 40,000 troops stationed on Hilton Head alone, and there's only, well, the new census, we'll see what it says, but previous census is 36,000 full-time residents on the island of Hilton Head. Now, as we travel into downtown Beaufort, all the homes that are on the point are all antebellum homes. They're all pre-Civil War. They were planters' homes, summer homes, and things like that. Most all of those homes were eventually turned into hospitals and command posts and things like that as they were used. Now, once the war ended, a lot of these guys started to make their way back home. Now, one Union commander basically wanted to make this area his home forever. And General Sherman was making his march to the sea as he started up in Virginia and was making his way down the coast. And he got to the old Sheldon Church, which he burnt, which I would have loved to see in its heyday because it is just magnificent. Haven't had a chance. It's definitely something to go see. And this Union commander actually went out to the old Sheldon Church and begged and pleaded with Sherman not to come to Beaufort. And that was actually Beaufort's saving grace. He somehow or another was able to convince him, and he agreed not to come to Beaufort. And he actually bypassed Beaufort, went inland, crossed some rivers in the Port Royal Sound, and worked his way down basically what we know as I-95 today, and then came into Savannah from the backside, from Pooler area back into Savannah. So downtown Beaufort has all kinds of things. It's some of the oldest homes in the state of South Carolina. It is the tabby Mecca. So for those of you that don't know what tabby is, so when these early European settlers came here, they were used to making their foundations out of concrete. But when they got to the coastline here, they realized there is no natural rock here. So they had to very quickly devise a way to come up with some sort of structural material that they could use to build foundations out of. And using the material that was here, the oyster shells, they actually created a concoction that was very similar to concrete. Now, the recipe for tabby was actually lost during the Civil War. The gentlemen that were here that knew how to make it, basically off the top of their heads, perished in the war or died of age, and it was never written down. And if it was, Union soldiers probably discarded it. They didn't think they needed it. So today, tabby has never been recreated to what it was back then. There are a couple of universities that are working on it. It is one of those mysteries we would love to figure out. University of Georgia is probably the closest. I've actually gone and seen some of their sites. They have a great place over on Ossabaw Island down south of Savannah, where they've figured out a recipe from parts and pieces that they've gathered. They are able to form, pour it in, and then let it dry, and it's solid. They can pull the forms off. After about 2 or 3 years, you can literally walk up to it and push it over like a sandcastle. It does not hold up to time like our structures downtown Beaufort have held up for years and years. And some of our other structures as well, like Fort Frederick in Port Royal, which is built completely out of tabby as well. Okay, so Civil War. Civil War's over. We're starting to try to get back into life here. And it was pretty tough, but There was something that was discovered here in our region of the world called phosphate. And phosphate was used at that point in time for fertilizer. And it was mined out of all of our waterways and the river bottoms and things. And it was actually done on land as well, where they would get some of these kind of shallow barrier islands and things that they would actually excavate. There's some areas, northern Beaufort County, that you can actually see the old phosphate mines. They're still there, where they've actually come in and it was basically dug in these long sloughs where they would dig down just to a certain depth. Then they would find about 12 to 14 inches of phosphate, and then that was it. So there's these real shallow pits that they dug, and they would dig in long, straight lines. And phosphate started to kind of create a product that we were shipping out of here, along with a lot of our other goods. Still, we were still shipping cotton that was grown here out of Port Royal. There was some indigo that was still being shipped out of here at that point in time, but then phosphate became the big thing. And there were processing plants. It was a big task. There was a lot of stuff coming out of here. There was one actually where we leave from on our tours at Port Royal Landing Marina. That was a phosphate processing plant. Where the State Port Authority into Paris Avenue, that was a processing plant as well. There was also one over on Paris Island too. Hurricane of 1893. We're moving pretty quickly through history here. Hurricane of 1893. I'm talking about hurricanes with hurricanes bearing down on us. It's kind of ominous, but the hurricane of 1893 was probably one of the biggest natural disasters that we have ever known on this East Coast. They don't actually know how to categorize it. They would say on our 1 through 5 hurricane scale that this was either probably a 6 or 7 that made landfall across Hilton Head over to Defusky, but your northeast quadrant, everything north of that, the eye of the hurricane gets it the worst. So what would have been St. Helena. Go back to this chart here. So storm coming in this way, St. Helena and all of that would have got it. Now, the reports state that St. Helena had over 20 feet of water come across it. If the houses weren't pushed off by water off their foundations, then you had 150, 200 mile an hour winds that came right behind it, that were blowing everything away. Pretty much Beaufort County, it's kind of sad, but most of the stories state that the only people that survived were the ones that tied themselves to oak trees. All of the phosphate fleet sunk. All of the dredges that were out in the river, nobody knew. You didn't get a week or two advantage of knowing that a storm like that was coming. The earliest thing that was heard here was that there was a cell that had passed by the Bahamas. They felt the low pressure. They were measuring barometric pressure, but for a message like that to travel, it actually got here about 3 days after the storm. And to kind of get a visual, as you go into downtown Beaufort, there's a hardware store right on the corner of Bay and Carteret. It used to be Fordham's Hardware. Now I think it's kind of a art store. That was actually it was a hardware store and a grocery store at that period of time. There was 4 feet of water inside of that store. No one thought they would ever recover. We were decimated. We had a governor at the time that wasn't the greatest governor, but he did start to try to send people down here. If you survived the storm, most people didn't survive the malaria or the starvation. But he sent doctors and things, and then the doctors got back to him and said, hey, we really need some help here. Like, this is really, really bad. So the Hurricane Fund started then, where all these people from all over the country started to donate money and food and supplies and things like that. And one of these books, it actually talks, there's a letter that was written with a check that was sent down here from a gentleman in Massachusetts. And it was $2,000. And $2,000 in that time frame was a ton of money. And the only thing in that letter that it said was, that's where I was born and raised. I will spend every dime to put it back together. So after that, we did recover. Our area started to actually thrive again. We were exporting timber out of here. We had plenty of trees to export. So a lot of the docks in Port Royal and stuff like that, we were sending out ships with timber and things like that. Some of the phosphate stuff did start to come back on a very small scale, not to what it was before the storm. And then we started to figure out that these waters were full of life, and fishing became the industry in our area. Started with the oysters. There was a gentleman, his name was Majoni. He immigrated over to actually into Savannah. And then he had actually some family members that were here, and they used to ride the ferry back and forth up to Beaufort to come and visit with family. And he basically saw, kind of after the Civil War, more or less, that there was a workforce and a product. So he actually started to create oyster canning factories. That gentleman went on to build 55 oyster canning factories in the state of South Carolina. Now, all of those oyster canning factories don't exist anymore except for two. Their family, the Majoni family, still actually owns a place out on Ladies Island that still processes oysters. Most of it is for wholesale for restaurants and things like that. And then the Bluffton Oyster Factory as well, which Mr. Toomer that owns the Bluffton Oyster Factory is a descendant of the original Mr. Majoni. And Larry cans just enough oysters to be considered a cannery, but it's just a couple of cases, but he's still trying to hold on to that tradition and still has the original labels that that factory was actually given. Then 1912, we started to get a couple of guys that came up from Fernandina, Florida, that had started to figure out that there were shrimp in our waters. And they brought a couple of very rudimentary boats up here, very small little battos that they could basically, almost like a seine net system, that they could kind of corral some shrimp. And they saw that there was a season here, and there was money to be made. And that started really our fisheries boom. Which you guys, I know, I've talked to Woody Collins, which is a great person I've known in my entire life. It's very eccentric. He's got some great stories. So he's probably covered some of this, but that same group from Fernandina eventually brought 5 boats up here, and they spent the summers here shrimping, even 5 bigger boats. That fleet in the next 3 years grew to 50 boats. And most of them were actually locally owned, or they were corporate boats where the factory actually owned them. There was a company that came in and actually on Spanish Point, kind of looking back towards the hospital right on the river there, they bought an old shipyard, and they actually built the largest building in the early 1920s in South Carolina on that piece of property to process and can shrimp to send them all over the world. It was also one of the first buildings in South Carolina to be fully electric as well, which is kind of an interesting fact that in that era. And then we started to realize that there were crabs in our waters, blue crabs to be exact. And Maryland at that point in time was the blue crab capital. They still technically are considered the blue crab capital of the United States, but they had decimated all of their crabs. So some of those guys came down here and they actually started to set up factories here, where they would pay local crabbers, local gentlemen to go out, catch the crabs, and then they would process them, and then they would send them back up to Maryland, which is still pretty much the process that we operate today for our local crabbers. The original one was actually, I've got a picture of it. Was here. So this may look very familiar once you kind of realize where this is. This is Port Royal. Where this building is actually where Fish Camp sits. I think, and I'm pretty sure that some of this building is still part of Fish Camp, this original factory. There is all, yeah, you can see this, it has very similar, still has similarities. And I don't think they built it to look like this old photo. So this was an oyster canning factory that eventually changed over to crabs. But our crab process wasn't great. The crab meat kind of got a yellow tint to it when they would steam them, and it wasn't as appealing as like fresh crabs. So it wasn't a booming business until a gentleman came that had a degree in molecular biology from one of the Ivy League schools. He had actually figured out a process that you could actually harvest the crab meat and it stayed pure white. And he actually patented that process. He, in Port Royal, actually about close to where the dry stack is in Port Royal, built a factory. And it was called Blue Channel Crab, where most all of the crab meat out of South Carolina was processed and then shipped out. This facility didn't quite do it. They kind of started to get back into shrimping. Once Blue Channel started, they couldn't compete. But if you can think 1920s, 1930s, a lot of people in the United States were not doing very well. South Carolina, Port Royal Sound was thriving. The people here, doesn't seem like a lot, but they could earn $2, $3 a day, which was a big payday. A lot more than most of the rest of the country was actually earning at that point in time, which helped because people were earning money, they were spending money. So all of the stores in downtown Beaufort, the grocery stores, the hardware stores, people were building houses. So like money was being spent and it stayed right here in Beaufort County, which was an amazing, this doesn't even cover half of the stuff. I've got 19 pages of information that we can dig into. But this is definitely a brief overview of the history of Port Royal Sound. The gentleman that I had mentioned, Ben Tillman, was the governor during 1893. When you read about him, he really wasn't a great guy, unfortunately. He tried to start a lot of things to help, but a lot of those things ended up being very corrupt. So one of the big negatives that happened here, so late 1800s, Port Royal was a huge Navy yard. Ben Tillman was on the Naval Commission's board and basically said, Port Royal's too small. We don't want Port Royal, we want to go to Charleston. So he steered the Southeast Fleet to Charleston and pulled them out of Port Royal, where Parris Island was a shipbuilding mecca. Actually, there's next to the Lyceum Dock, if you're familiar with Parris Island, there is an old slipway that was built. That's where they used to build ships and stuff for the Navy. And actually, that was the largest slipway in the United States at one point in time. But Mr. Tillman steered all these guys. If we probably would have continued with the Navy here, we would be Norfolk. Norfolk wouldn't exist. It would all be here. The South Atlantic Fleet would be here. But that change kind of helped us in a way. So once the Navy pulled out, they had all these buildings and facilities on Parris Island. These new Marines that had just been to war and had just started, the Marine Corps was just getting started, they needed jobs. So the Navy sent them to Parris Island to basically protect the buildings, so derelicts and things like that didn't take over them. Once the Marine Corps got there, they actually started to establish a training base, which is now what we know as the Marine Corps Recruitment Depot. So all males this side of the Mississippi that join the Marine Corps, that's where they go for basic training. Actually, up until the first of this year, all females in the United States that joined the Marine Corps, that's where they would have gone for basic training. Beginning of this year, they opened another female training facility over in California. So now they use the Mississippi as a split as well. And then another thing, Mr. Chilman, kind of talking about him a lot today. Another thing that he got into, so during the end of Prohibition, when we were actually in certain counties, we were allowed to sell alcohol. Mr. Chilman instituted the dispensary. They were government, state-run buildings and operations that would bottle anyone's alcohol, but they had to be sold in South Carolina bottles. This is what they refer to as a JoJo. There was also a pint bottle that you'll see around every now and then. You can come up and take a look. It's really pretty. It's got a palmetto tree, South Carolina. It says dispensary on it. This worked for a handful of years. Most counties that were not still, in Prohibition had a dispensary, and most of them had a bottler as well. All alcohol had to be sold in these bottles. Now, the funds from these bottles was going in somebody's back pocket, and that was Mr. Tillman, unfortunately. And it ended up being a very, very corrupt thing where people weren't being paid back for, they were giving their alcohol up that they had made, on kind of a retainer, basically saying, hey, when we sell it, we'll pay you back. They were never being paid. And then eventually the South Carolina dispensary was basically shut down because it was just such a corrupt system. So I did bring 2 of a 3-set-part books with me. These are, if you have any kind of questions about the history of our area, these are great books. They are long, they are hard to read. You can read a couple of pages a night and then you're kind of like done. But they are great books. The best one that I think is actually the Bridges of the Sea Island, Past and Present. I'd say 3/4 of the book is history. And then the last is our more modern history. And it actually does talk about bridges. And the thoughts and the theories of where we were going to build bridges and the islands that we really wanted to have access to. Believe it or not, Bay Point, which there's not much left of Bay Point, it's eroding pretty badly. Bay Point they were going to build a bridge to Bay Point, which is a crazy thought. They were also going to they were never going to build a bridge to Hilton Head. That was always going to be a ferry. They were actually going to build the bridge to Defusky. And that also had to do with the canning facilities and the people that lived there. There were more people living on Defusky at that point in time than there were on Hilton Head before we started to develop Hilton Head. But at that, we'll do some questions if anybody has any.
Where do you see us going in the future now that we know the past?
No, that's a great question. That is a great question. And my answer to that question is we cannot forget this stuff. If we forget the past and we erase this past, we are doomed. Because these people are predecessors that were here, and not just in Beaufort County, in all of the world, have lived these lives before, basically. They have done the ups and downs. They have seen what works and what doesn't work. And if we start to forget that and erase that, we're doomed. we're going back down. Yes?
What about the effects of climate change?
Okay, so climate change. I get this question a lot on our tours. My 40 years here, I can actually physically say I do not see any difference. Now, the Low Country Institute, which is basically who puts on the Master Naturalist course, they run out of Spring Island. It's a great operation. They have studied this, and they have actually probably about 20 years of data that they have actually been studying. They say that the Port Royal Sound rises 1 to 2 millimeters a year. Now, the national East Coast average is 3 to 4 millimeters a year. So we are definitely below average. But as you can see, where's this one picture? This picture here. So this is an island called Dawes Island, and this is just a little kind of spit out off of Dawes Island. This would have been high ground in the probably 1400s. Actually on the, down this way, there's actually on Dawes Island, there are some trees and there's a pond, and you can Google map and it's really cool. You can actually see the structure of the plantation house that was on Dawes Island. But most of Dawes Island, as Rob knows, you can actually pull on a high tide, you can push a flats boat or a little john boat all over this island that has basically kind of settled into the sea.
Is there any future for ferry service from Port Royal to Hilton Head or something?
At this point, I don't know of any. Ferries do create an issue. You have to have a start and a stop point, and you also have to have vehicles. Hilton Head is not going to give up land to build a ferry dock, or parking or anything like that. Over here on this side of the county, we do have some areas that you could build a ferry dock to make your way over there. But at this point in time, I don't think that there is. And after the debacle, if you've been reading the newspaper about the Defusky Island ferry and how well that doesn't work, you'll see that it's probably not in the near future, if in the future.
How's the quality of the water, surrounding us here?
So our water quality is perfect. We could never ask for any better water quality. That goes into our ecosystem. With that big tide that flushes all of our water in and out, it cleans us all the time. Watching the oyster industry, oysters are filter feeders. They filter everything, all the little microorganisms and bacteria that are in our water, and they are monitored. South Carolina DHEC, Department of Health, they constantly monitor the oysters. They do find where our engineering is not as great, and we end up with sewer leaks and runoff and things like that. So there ends up being areas of oysters that get damaged, basically. They don't die, but they're not healthy. They say about 4 or 5 tide cycles, and they're perfectly clean again. Once they stop the source afterwards, 4 or 5 tide cycles, and they have cleaned themselves out. Beaufort County has never had any kind of red tides. We've never had bad algae, bacteria blooms, or anything like that that are out of the norm, like a red tide would be. So yeah, we're super, super healthy. As long as we don't let our golf courses and stuff run off fertilizers and things like that, then we should, in the future, and that's something that's monitored very, very closely, we should be great for the future.
Thank you.
There's one more over here.
Captain John, I'm fascinated with the shell rings.
The shell rings.
Does Beaufort Dolphin Adventures go to any of the shell rings or close to the shell rings? Can you go to them?
trying to think. These out on Dalls, like I said, it takes a special kind of boat to get up there. It's real shallow. So these are not accessible, and technically dry land on Dalls is still owned. So we can't get to these. I do know in some areas where there are a couple of shell mounds or middens that we can travel past. They're not to this magnitude, but they are definitely bluffs that lead into the river, that basically these same things were kind of happening, where they were releasing the spirits back out into the wild and things like that, that we can pass by.
How many are there now that you're aware of?
No one knows. Yeah, no one honestly knows. Unfortunately, if you've been over by the Broad River Boat Ramp, and they've cleared that land out there, right there by that intersection, they bulldozed about 10 of these. That's why that process was shut down and stopped for about 2 years. They weren't doing any construction, is because they went in there without having any kind of archaeological survey or anything like that, and they basically bulldozed them. And that's probably happened to most of the ones around our area. There is, in all of my books and things about Native Americans in our area, Barnwell Island, which is part of Chelsea Plantation, just up the river here from y'all, on the other side of the Whale Branch, has some of the most magnificent ones, but no one is allowed to step foot on it.
Bobby Bay
Yes.
does have a shell ring that
Yep.
is accessible.
Yes.
At certain times of the year, it's restricted, but yes, you can go there and actually see
Yep.
that upper photo that they show.
Yeah, so that's Fig Isle, and that's in the marsh behind Botany Bay.
Yeah.
But yeah, out of all the areas, it does take about 2 hours to get there. If you do want to go and just explore, Botany Bay is an amazing place. They are honestly starting to think, from all the archaeological research that's there, that is probably one of the first settlements on the East Coast, was at Botany Bay. It's crazy. The artifacts and the information and stuff. And the other side of that, Botany Bay sticks out, used to stick out a little bit farther than Edstep. So the beach is eroding just like Honey Island, and all that sand is moving down to the north end of Edstep. So they're trying to do as much research and things, and that's why there's only certain days that you can visit, because the other days they have the archaeologist over there looking and digging and stuff like
The Intracoastal Waterway.
that. Yes.
What is it? Why is it?
Okay,
When
so
was it?
the first talk of what we now would know as the Intercoastal Waterway started back in 1808. Now, it was only proposed to go from Massachusetts to Beaufort, North Carolina. That proposal never went anywhere. Wasn't until late 1800s that they actually started to build that. Woodrow Wilson was one of the big, our president was one of the big pushes for starting a intercoastal waterway. And the original idea was it was actually a military thing. So we could actually move troops and ships and things behind the protection of our barrier islands, from Norfolk all the way down to Florida. Now, Beaufort County is pretty unique, and most of Georgia as well. All of our intercoastal waterway are natural rivers that link together. Only above Georgetown, South Carolina, did they actually have to dig in South Carolina. Now, over the years, that has been modified and changed. They've shortened the route. I'll say like 1940s, they took almost 200 miles out by digging smaller, shorter little channels and cuts through islands and other ways and things like that. Basically leading from Norfolk, Virginia, all the way down to the Keys. Then we built the cut through Lake Okeechobee, and then they actually started to finish what we know as the Gulf Intercoastal, which goes all the way Florida, all the way around to Brownsville, Texas. So in modern times today, you can basically leave from Norfolk, Virginia, and go all the way to Mexico. Brownsville, Texas is right on the border, in a protected waterway, as they call it. I like to call it a semi-protected waterway, because you do have to cross some big open sounds and things like our Port Royal Sound, which on certain days
Yeah,
is not great.
Exactly.
So, but it's definitely a safe passage other than, running offshore, especially if you're trying to hide from the weather and things like that. The intercoastal waterway in our area actually changed. That was one of those cuts that they actually did. Originally, it actually never came into Beaufort. Originally, it actually would have come from behind Edisto Island, across the St. Helena Sound, behind Harbor Island, Hunting Island, Fripp Island, then into Trunkerts, and then kind of behind St. Philip's Island and Bay Point out of Station Creek, and then you would have come out into the Port Royal Sound. And then they basically said that it was too desolate out there, that if you needed to hide or anything like that, there was nowhere to stop. So that's when they eventually started to use the Beaufort River and stuff like that to link to it. Yes?
So I have a little bit different type of question. So you said you're a third generation
Yes.
Beaufortonian. So I have two parts to my question.
Okay.
So your family was involved in what industry here or what type of work? And also, do you see, why are you guessing?
I mean, it's a great question. I'm trying to think of how to get into this.
And do you see members of your own generation staying on as shrimpers or tourist industry, or most of them have left for other shores?
Okay, so my family has actually deeper roots than third generation. My family lineage actually came from Europe to Beaufort County through Paris Island. 1726, they actually immigrated from Europe, from Scotland to Paris Island. They met a husband and wife, well, they weren't husband and wife, they actually met on the ship by themselves. They got married by the captain of the ship, landed here, couple of generations, grew up here in Beaufort County, and then moved to Colleton County. Then my grandparents were born, my great-grandparents moved here for military purposes. Then my grandparents were, my dad's side were in the military here in Beaufort, born and raised. And then my mom's side, my great-grandfather came down from New York with cattle and actually owned Lobico. Owned the post office and the little house next to Lobico, and then the old plantation house that's actually tucked back in the woods back there, and owned what is the chemical plant that's off of Kinlock Road and all of that, which is now county property. The county bought it back eventually. So then my grandfather was born there, and then my mom was actually born on the farm, and then they started working in. My grandfather was on Paris, my mom's dad was on Paris Island, my grandmother worked at the hospital, so it just made sense to move into town and off the farm, and that's when they sold the farm. Growing up, my father was a commercial shrimper. I always aspired to be a shrimper. You ever ask me as a kid what I was going to do when I grew up? I was a shrimper. No questions asked. The day of my high school graduation, my father sold 2 shrimp boats and the shrimp dock. I did not know until I walked across the stage and went and met my parents after the ceremony, and my dad said, well, we sold the business. You're not gonna be a shrimper. He actually forbid me to be a shrimper. He didn't want that for me, but early 2000s, the end of 1900s, 1999, 98, and the early 2000s was really tough. That's when fuel prices were starting to skyrocket, and then import shrimp started to become a big thing here. And over in Indonesia and Taiwan and places like that, they can grow the shrimp in ponds a lot cheaper than it costs for true local seafood to be caught. Somehow or another, there is no difference between the price. So if the Taiwanese shrimp mark their shrimp at $1 a pound, that's what the boats here are. And at $5 a gallon for fuel, $1 a pound for shrimp, it takes a lot to recuperate that. Now, I have gone, there has been great shrimping seasons, good money to be made, and I've struck out, and I've run boats, and I've worked on boats, and I've done very well with that. But definitely my dad has always kind of pushed me towards private sector boats, running like the big sport fishers and even working on the tugs. And the tour business was kind of something I fell into. I kind of got tired of working on the tugs, and I started a little charter fishing business, and wasn't getting enough phone calls to make ends meet. So I eventually went and worked for a company on Hilton Head. Is actually where I met Rob. Rob got out of the military and started to come work there as well. And that's where I kind of cut my teeth on the ecosystem and the history, and it's something that I've always done my entire life. I just didn't know. My parents had taught this stuff to me at a very young age. And as a kid, you're like, I don't need to know about Native Americans. I don't need to know about fossils or anything like that. I'll never use that. But now I look back and I'm like, this is
Like part of me.
yeah, it's definitely part of me. You guys are more than welcome to come up and look. All of these artifacts are from Beaufort County. There's megalodon teeth, there's whale vertebrae, there's mammoth teeth. We think it's a mammoth of some sort, some of this big thing here. We have the bottle, we have some settlers pottery as well, and then some Native American artifacts too. Any other questions? Yes?
Can you tell us a little bit about the dolphins in the area? What's their population? Do they stay around?
So I have availability Saturday at noon. So we do have a very healthy population of dolphins here. We have about 200 residents that live here year-round. They don't ever leave. And then starting about mid-March through typically Thanksgiving, we have migratory groups of dolphins that are passing through here. They guesstimate that during the summer months, we have somewhere in the realm of about 2,000 dolphins in Beaufort County, not including the 200 that live here full-time. Is that enough? That answer your question? That's what we do for a business, so I don't want to sell the farm.
Are those tagged that people follow?
So they don't have to tag dolphins.
Okay.
They're all dolphin dorsal fins are unique. It's like their thumbprint. No two are the same. So there are groups that do monitor the dolphins. University of South Carolina Beaufort has a marine mammal program, and they take their students out on a boat every Wednesday. And they basically, they start over on Lemon Island, they go out around Dawes Island, and then they come back up the Broad River and they go back to Lemon Island. And they basically photograph every single dolphin dorsal fin that they see. Then they spend the rest of their week in a lab going through these massive photo albums, matching all these little dorsal fins together. But any kind of information like, oh, well, this is a female with a newborn, they'll actually start a profile on that newborn. But it's kind of interesting, like there's a female that we see here every year. We've seen her for about 8 years, and every other year she has a newborn. So it's just some really cool information like that comes from that.
It's interesting to collect data, but who actually manages it? I mean, data for data's sake,
So-
no use.
So yes, and that is something that all these different groups have kind of run into. That everybody has a photo album and everybody's photographed the same dolphin, and you know, the information was never honestly data-based. So NOAA is actually the National Oceanographic Administration, Atmospheric Administration, is actually starting to do a digital database that all of those groups will actually have access to.
That's just more data collected in the Does the status out there allow to use the data to do anything, or do we just watch the population die off one day?
No, so we do use the data. So all that data that's been collected, and it's been done for years and years and years, if the data collectors are starting to notice, hey, it's the middle of July and we've seen 4 dolphins today, they start to look and they start to try to figure out, like, dig into what is going on. Luckily with the dolphins, we don't have that issue. Now, here locally, we did have an issue with, and it kind of went back to data collectors, basically, that discovered it. And it was our wading birds. Our egrets and herons, 25 to 30 years ago, were just, the numbers were just bombing. They weren't coming, they weren't nesting, you weren't seeing them at your lagoons and your ponds or along the creek banks. So they came in, they did the research to figure out what was going on, and they actually came to figure out that at that point in time, there was a lot of development, a certain type of development, tract homes basically, that were being built in Beaufort County. People were buying old farmland that wasn't being farmed anymore, that had natural wetlands on them or ponds on them that would have been wooded and shrubbed. Farmer didn't really need them. And these tract builders were coming in and they were basically clearing all this land out and cleaning up around the ponds, and they were destroying the nesting sites. So the state basically said, all right, here's the new rule. And they actually put a law in place that states that if the wetland predates the development, you cannot touch it. It has to be left wooded and natural. Now, if you buy a piece of property and you want to dig a pond so you can have a pretty water view, then you can do as you please with the new pond, but the old ponds have to be left the way naturally they grow. And just by doing that, brought all of our wading birds back to where they are. And there's actually one species of bird that thrived, the wood stork. The wood stork in that era was actually on the endangered species list. And just by protecting the wetlands here for those nesting sites, the wood stork, there are now more living in Beaufort County today than was perceived to be alive in the world 20 years ago. So the data collection, if it's used properly, I think is the question you're asked, it works.
Not used properly.
If it's used.
There has to be an institution to do it.
Yes. Yeah. And an institution that is doing it for the good as well.
When we took the May River tour, they talked about that the marshes migrate. Is that accurate or not?
They do move. So as our tides and currents move things around, sand sediments constantly, it's particles in our water and it collects in certain areas. So somewhere 10, 15 years ago, you used to go through there, you knew there was a shallow spot, you'd go around it, but at low tide, you really didn't see it. Today, you go by there and it sticks out of the water and there's Spartina grass growing on top of it. That's what they're talking about when they migrate. And then also, with the column of water that moves in and out of here, it will dig, water's gonna find the quickest path, the easiest, least resistant path. So it will dig out a bend, or it will cut out a corner and make a little oxbow area and things like that. That's part of the migration of the marshes. Yes.
What about the pelicans? At one point in Habersham, a whole bunch of them came and were on our docks. I don't know if anybody remembers them. Are they, where are they? And we had one land on our boat, couldn't get on.
Yeah, probably in the winter. Was it cooler months when it sat on your boat?
Probably.
Yeah. That's the thing that the pelicans do. They get used to boats. Some of our local pelicans get used to boats. They get used to the crabbers and things that are coming through. They get a free meal basically out of it. The crabbers aren't intentionally feeding them, but they know in the winter there's not a whole bunch of boats moving through. So they tend to zero in on a boat that's out there, and they will land on them and things like that. We've actually had one land on the tour boat. It's like December last year. It just sat on the bow of the boat, just came through. But pelicans are interesting because they tend to spend most time in the surf, but when certain fish hatch, they will move their way back into the marsh systems and inland a ways, and also weather. Weather makes it. I was out yesterday all day. We probably saw 500 pelicans, and it's probably they knew this cell or this front was coming, so they were trying to get back to a little bit more protection.
I just want you to know that we could listen for hours. You are a wealth of knowledge, and the fact that you have such a long history here, okay? No more third generation Beaufortonian.
Yeah.
But I just want to say thank you, and Cynthia, if you would come up as well, and Rob, we just want to say thank you for tonight. This was just a very, very special night for all of us. We learned so much. Like I said, matter of fact, fish camp will never be the same for me any longer. Every time I come, I'm going to be looking at it differently. But thank you for your expertise and your passion around Beaufort and the Port Royal Sound. We really appreciate it. We are grateful that you came. And Rob, thank you also as an owner of Beaufort Dolphin Adventures. And I hope all of you will have an opportunity to take advantage of their wonderful tours. They are fascinating, as you can tell. All right, and Cynthia,
Thank you so much.
Oh, thank
Very,
you.
very, very interesting. You could have gone on and on.
Yeah, I didn't know if I was going to be able to fill an hour, but then there's like 5 more slides that we need to get to.
Thank you.
We appreciate it. Thank you.